Welcome, everybody, to a Saturday special edition of UFO Man Live. We decided to interview a gentleman that came all the way from the United Kingdom by the name of Philip Mantle, and also his sidekick and co-conspirator in writing a book, or co-author, Dr. Irena, let's see if I can say this right, McCammon Scott. Please welcome them to our panel. We're going to be discussing the Pascagoula alien abduction incident involving Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker, and the book that they recently released to the public. It's a work that was actually presented to Calvin Parker before he passed. He actually wrote the foreword to the book. So it's a very good piece of work. And if you're interested in buying the book, you need to go to Amazon. It is available there. Pick up a copy so that you can remember Calvin Parker and his life. And you can also experience the viewpoints and perspectives of Dr. Irena Scott and Philip Mantle. Irena says that she is science-based, and she's also a ufologist. Philip Mantle is a book publisher in the UK, and he is very prolific in that matter. I've seen a lot of his books that come out. Very good content. If you can, what is it called? Flying Disc Press. If you look up Flying Disc Press on Google, I'm sure you can find him and some of his content, and maybe support some of the other authors. Philip Mantle is also a ufologist. All right. On our panel tonight, we have Nicole Weber, or AKA Coley.
Hello.
We also have Noss in the center. We have Odessa, our maven of the chat room. And we have our very talented ufologist and experiencer, Nancy Timms. So, all right. Yeah. You did it the right way, too, because you don't want to turn it around when you're in Britain.
Oh,
I learned that the hard way. This means peace, right?
Yeah.
That means peace. The other way does not, so don't do it the other way. All right. I learned that the hard way.
I didn't know that.
I didn't either.
I learned it the hard way. I guess a friend of mine who lives in Liverpool said that he had a couple of friends come over from the U.S. and they kept flashing peace signs from the cabbie, right? But they kept sawing people getting angry at them. And they didn't understand why. And I'm not going to explain what the word means, but it's a bad word that we use in the U.S. And this way is peace, but the other way is not.
Okay.
So, it's
I'll have to Google it because I don't know.
It's an interesting piece of trivia. Okay, so what we're going to do is leave the panel open like this because we can see Irena and Philip at the same time. If we need to bring them up full screen because their explanation of something is longer, I will do so. If you have questions in the chat room, please put them in capital letters so that we can see the questions and address them on screen. Okay, I'm going to have Philip tell us a little bit about his background and how he became a book publisher in the first place, especially concerning the UFO topic.
Yeah, my pleasure. I mean, going back in time as a young man, as a young lad, I was always interested in all things paranormal, guys. You know, I would read whatever I could lay my hands on, which wasn't a lot in those days. That we lived in a small place. There wasn't a major bookstore or big library, so whatever I could lay my hands on, I would read. And you know, as I left high school, I had this interest, and it developed from a wide view, but concentrated on the UFO topic. I was interested in the space program, for example, and I read an astronomy book, and it had one chapter in it on UFOs, and that sort of intrigued me. So when I got to about I was 20 years of age, I went to work in West Germany. Couldn't speak a word of German, so I phoned my mum up and said, "Can you send me some books, Mum?" So she did, and the box of books that arrived were all about UFOs, all paperbacks. So when I returned home in 1979, I had a bit more knowledge about it. I live in West Yorkshire in the north of England, and we used to live just outside of the city of Leeds. And Leeds has an evening newspaper. It's called the Yorkshire Evening Post. And my aunt, who lived round the corner, brought me a copy round one evening, and she pointed to a little advertisement. And it was the formation of the Yorkshire UFO Society. They're having a meeting that coming Sunday in Leeds. So I caught the bus. I didn't drive in those days. I went into Leeds. I found this place, and it was in a big building. It was a little room hired out of this other building, about 30 people there. And one of the things I spotted straight away, of course, they had books. They had a table full of them. So I thought, this is due for me. But the Yorkshire UFO Society was formed by two brothers, Graham and Mark Birdsall. And I was hooked. I paid my membership, which I think was a couple of dollars for the whole year. And slowly but surely, I got more and more interested and wanted to learn more and get more involved. And I became an investigator with them. Later on, I joined a national group called the British UFO Research Association. I served as their press officer, their conference organizer, and their director of investigations. I was also the MUFON representative for England for a while as well. But then, as time progressed, I'd authored or co-authored a couple of books. But in 2015, technology had changed, and there was a friend of mine by the name of John Hanson, ex-police detective, had opened his own publishing concern called Haunted Skies. Highly recommend it. And I'd been sent a manuscript from a colleague in Poland, not to publish. He was wanting to practice his English. He was very good at spoken English, but he wanted to practice his written English. And he sent me this manuscript, which I read, and I sent it back to him. And I thought, I'll make a hell of a book, So my colleague John Hanson said, well, why don't you start your own little publishing concern? So I did, and I called it Flying Disc Press. And the first book I published was UFOs over Poland, and that was in 2015. Come 2016, 2017, I had the opportunity to take early retirement from my proper job, my day job, the one that paid the bills. So I did. And I jumped in both feet with Flying Disc Press. And here I am, several years later, published over 30 books from a wide variety of people in different parts of the world. And long may it last. That's it in a nutshell.
Okay. Hold on here. I need to switch. Okay, we're back to this. All right. IRENA, tell us a little bit about your background for people who do not know who you are and how you got involved in the UFO field and authoring books about UFOs and alien experiencers.
Okay. I was in two different things, science and ufology. And they usually say scientists and ufologists are on two different worlds and, don't agree. Well, I started out when I was a real small kid, I wanted to be an astronomer. And I went through school and wanted to be an astronomer, went to college and started applying for jobs. And they said, no females. This is male only. And so I didn't get into astronomy, but I went into research. And first of all, I was still trying to get into astronomy and I couldn't get in. So I tried to get in mapping, and I did get into cartography and worked with the government as a physical scientist. And then in trying to get into astronomy again, I wound up in the Defense Intelligence Agency, using satellite photography and identifying airplanes over communist areas and all that kind of thing. And then I got married. My husband, I was in Washington, D.C., and my husband was in Nevada. And I didn't understand it at first, but he had worked for Area 51, and he told me about it, and I'd never heard of Area 51 at the time. And so I didn't know what he was talking about. That's why he was in Nevada, and we were there for a while. And then we moved back, and I got a PhD from the School of Veterinary Medicine and became a professor, worked at Cornell for a while, and then became a professor in St. Bonaventure University. Then my husband changed jobs, and I followed him and turned out in Ohio, working for different places, including Battelle Memorial Institute and Ohio State University, but with astronomy. When I was a very young kid, and before I had any idea of what never even heard of UFOs, my sister and I, when we were really young kids, she was sure she wasn't in school yet, and I don't remember whether I was or not. We were around 6 years old or so. We had something flying around our room that was really strange, and we both remember it very well, and so does our family. And we could talk about it then because nobody had ever heard of UFOs, and so they didn't say, "Oh, you saw a UFO, you're crazy." Well, when we found out about UFOs, you weren't supposed to talk about them, and we both had several sightings separately, and we had a very long one together once. We grew up in Ohio, and the first ones were in Ohio, but then she was in Drew University doing post-grad work, and I was working for the Defense Intelligence Agency and actually analyzing and identifying aircraft. And we went to a vacation up in the New England states, and in Massachusetts, we had this very long, unexpected UFO sighting, and we almost got killed. And so at the time, I wrote a lot of notes about it, but I was working for the DIA, so I didn't say anything about it. I just, once in a while, I said something about UFOs, but I didn't go around saying, "I see UFOs," because, you might lose your clearance and be out on the street. But I wrote up everything, and I intended to report sometime. And so eventually, as I got near or to retirement, I started joined some UFO groups. Actually, somebody invited me to give a speech about something I'd investigated, and I found out about UFO groups, and that's how I joined. And I was on the board of directors for MUFON for a while. But what I first investigated was this strange sound heard over a lot of the United States. And this was funny because I was in Missouri and my mother was in Ohio, 600 miles away. And she's a real skeptic and not a UFO person at all. We weren't allowed to talk about the subject. But she called me one day and said, one night, and said, "Did you hear that noise?" And I told her, I asked her what she was talking about, and she said it was an explosion. And I told her, you're flipping, your mind's going, because I couldn't hear it because, it's 600 miles away. But later she called me and said that there was a big UFO flap in Ohio and that people were keeping their kids in and staying in at night and everything else. And it turned out that later, I didn't take too much interest in it then, but one day I became curious about what on earth that was. And I was in the Ohio State University Library, and I really didn't know when it was or anything else, but I walked into a newspaper room just wandering around, seeing if I could find anything, and I did. And it was October the 11th, 1973, and I happened to notice at that time that there was an abduction, which was a Pascagoula abduction, but I didn't pay attention to that. Instead, I paid attention to the sound, which is really mysterious and it's never been explained yet. And a seismologist from the state of Ohio seismologist and things helped me investigate it. And I got a report in a scientific journal. But anyway, that many years late after this happened, many years later, I was with Philip writing books, and Calvin's book really exploded about the Pascagoula abduction. And he asked me to help interview people, and I was really interested because I'd done all this research earlier. And so that's how I got into this.
Right. Did you get a chance to interview the extra witnesses that came forward after the encounter? I think there were 2 ladies and a couple men.
Yeah. You mean the Blairs?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. I interviewed them before they had realized, well, we didn't approach them. They kind of approached us in a way because Calvin had a show on YouTube, and people had watched it, and their daughter had made a comment that she knew this was true because their parents had seen it, the abduction. And so that was a very funny comment. And Philip contacted him and got a hold of him, and then sent the information to me to interview him. And this was my very first interview, which was, I started out with Jerry Blair, and he said he was a skeptic, and he said that he heard a splash and a big sound, and then he thought of me it was a blimp or something, and handed the phone to her. Well, she had this story about they were sitting by this pier, and it turned out that the pier was across the river from where the abduction took place. And they had, first of all, she had seen this object flying around, and it was very funny. It was low, and she didn't know what it was, but she said she thought it was an airplane, and she wondered what it was doing, because it just randomly going here and there and nowhere, and there was no landing strip there or anything. Mm-hmm. And then her husband decided, they were waiting for his supervisor to come because he was going on a ship, and he and the supervisor going out to provision some oil wells or something. And so he decided to take his clothes down to the ship, and they were walking down the pier with him in front. And she said that she was walking along, that this thing flopped up in front of her, right on the pier, right in front of her. And it looked like a person. And it went back down, and she couldn't figure out what it was or why it didn't come up for air, because she thought a person had come up for air, and she couldn't figure it out. And this was about 9 o'clock. They went to the ship. For some reason, much later, about 12 o'clock, she was coming back, and she was so scared that she ran all the way back to the pier and back to the car and jumped in and left. But then it came out in the paper the next day about the abduction, and she realized that she had seen that. But she was, when I interviewed over a period of a couple of years, and she was very, very emotional about this thing that flopped up in the pier in front of her. And she just had a whole lot of emotion, but she didn't know why she had the emotion. I mean, she thought something funny happened, but she couldn't put the idea into words or anything, or couldn't figure out what it was. And her husband was a skeptic. Then her husband, unfortunately, became very ill and died. And right before he went on a ventilator, he told her that they had been abducted, and that he hadn't talked about it because, like Calvin, who kept quiet about it for about 50 years, he didn't want to be harassed and have people, say you're crazy and lose his job and things like that, which I could understand because I worked for the CIA. I sure didn't say anything about anything. So anyway, then later she tried hypnosis and remembered an abduction, and he had told her that he didn't tell her about it because he had wanted to protect her, and he didn't want to talk about it. And so she knows more about it then, but she had a lot of emotion before she knew anything about it too, which I experienced when I talked to her.
We're talking about Calvin's wife?
No, about
Mrs. Blair.
Mrs. Blair.
Okay, gotcha. There was an another gentleman that also saw it supposedly land on the bank of the Pascagoula behind Calvin and Charles. And I don't remember his name because I had him on camera, but I can't tell you who he is.
Rusty Anderson?
Yeah, that's him. Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, where the pier was, there was a freeway going over, which is in the picture there. Route 90, which is a big interstate freeway. At that time, I think it had a drawbridge or something. I don't think it was exactly like it is now. And it didn't have as much traffic, but this man was going over the bridge. And he saw something odd too, which attracted his attention. And he said he saw this low-flying thing, but there was no airport there, no landing strip. And he thought it was crashing because it was so low, but he couldn't figure out what it was doing. But he was driving along on the bridge. Then the next day he visited his aunt, and his aunt lived in a place where she could see. She was west of the Pascagoula, but she could look out over that area. And she saw something funny too. And they both saw it and thought it was odd. And then later, Philip interviewed another woman who had also seen it. It turned out she was a cousin of Rusty, so 3 people in the family had seen it separately.
And that's what gives a lot of credence to the story of Calvin and Charles Hickson. They had outsiders come forward and testified to what they saw on the same day, which is really cool. And I think one of them saw something the day before.
Yeah, I mean, we have witnesses seeing things on the running to the Hickson and Parker abduction, and also in the preceding days as well. I mean, you know, within hours of this happening, they were in Jackson County Sheriff's Office with Sheriff Fred Diamond. And it was only during the research in this book we found a newspaper cutting, and it said that Sheriff Fred Diamond had seen something, but a couple of days later. We also communicated with the police dispatcher who was on duty that night. He's the guy that took the telephone call from Charles Hickson, and he said that he took over 50 calls from members of the public reporting UFOs that night. And when he finished his shift, was back in the station in person, there was people there still reporting it. So it wasn't just a one-off incident with Charlie and Calvin. It was happening all around the area. And what we subsequently learned as well, of course, down the years, that there was a huge flap of sightings that year across the United States. A chap called Howard, I think it's Howard Webb, wrote a book about it, and he called it 1973, the year of the humanoids. And it would seem that, you know, October of that year was the peak. You know, that was the peak of these sightings and these encounters. And of course, we also have this mysterious sound that went halfway across the United States, the same date, the 11th of October, 1973, that IRENA investigated, and much, much more, you know. And people have criticized us, saying that all these testimonies that are 50 years old, they're not worth anything. Well, I said I beg to differ. We've had some pretty high-profile criminal cases here in the last couple of years to do with celebrities, you know, and young underage men and women. And most of the testimony was historical in nature, because these events happened in the 1960s and 70s. It's a bit like what Mr. Epstein was up to, you know, with young ladies and what have you. Most of that testimony was historical in nature. So I said, I beg to differ, you know. And but we also found physical evidence. When I first started working with Calvin Parker, when he was writing his first book, I said, Calvin, do you have any documents, photographs, anything? He says, no, I lost everything in Hurricane Katrina. So I said, okay, well, one of my jobs will be to pester the living daylights politely out of anyone and everyone I can think of who may have had something. Now, In 1973, the two main investigators of the case were Dr. James Harder of APRO and Alan Hynek. Later that year, Hynek formed the Center for UFO Studies. Both men are now deceased, but I contacted the Center for UFO Studies. You know, have you got anything on Pascagoula? Yeah, sure, Philip, no problem. Sent me a file, a PDF, most of which was newspaper cuttings. But right in the middle of it is a one-page typewritten document. So it's written on an old-fashioned manual typewriter. It's dated October the 13th, 1973, so 2 days after the event. And basically describes Charlie and Calvin stripping down to their underwear, and they'd be given a check. And it says they found, in inverted commas, puncture wounds on Charlie's arm and on Calvin's foot. Now, when you listen to the testimony, there you go. This is one of the photographs. When you listen to the testimony of both gentlemen, Charlie says when these creatures got hold of him, he felt a prick in his arm. Calvin said that when they had him inside this thing and had him laid down, they took his lower clothing off, including his shoes and socks, and stuck something in his foot, and it hurt. But this document then went on to mention photographs. Well, there were no photographs, so we thought, fair enough. Sometime later, a year or two later, the same guy emailed me again and said, Philip, I found these today. I'm sure you've already got them, but I thought I'd send you them anyway. And these were the photographs, one of which you've shown there. So it was of these very small but minor injuries. So you have Charlie and Calvin saying, we felt these minor injuries. It was Dr. James Harder who gave them the physical exam. And then we have the photographs of them as well. And they are published in our book for the first time. That was the first time they'd ever seen the light of day. So it's not all in the mind. There is these are not laser guided scars or anything like that. They are minor injuries, but nonetheless, in our humble opinion, it is a direct physical link to whatever happened to Charlie and Calvin that night.
Right. A lot of abductees we've interviewed on channel have claimed marks. In fact, Nicole Weber, our co-host, has marks. She has scoop marks, right, Nicole? You're muted.
Yeah, those were the first ones that I had were like these scoop marks that almost look like numbers in a way. It was on my lower abdomen. And then the weirdest one that I had was a star map that was on my leg. And it was like something I had drawn December, I believe. And then like 6 months later, I think it was July, it showed up on my leg. And I was like, this is insane. I have pictures of all of it. But yeah, I've definitely, I've had some of my wrist, and then and then something like moved quick up, and MUFON thought maybe that they had some sort of implant because they did in fact move. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But
what I was trying to get at, Philip, was this adds credence to a case. So in Calvin's case and Charles, it added a lot of credibility.
Well, not only that, within hours of it happening, they're in the sheriff's department's office, and they are recorded secretly. Charlie and Calvin in a room on their own, unknown to them. There is a tape recorder in the desk next to them. The deputy comes in later and removes it. They have no idea what he's doing, and they think, well, we've got them now. You know, they'll be laughing and giggling, and of course they weren't. And it's what became known as the secret tape. And of course, then Dr. Harder and Hynek came. Before they left, they held a press conference. Dr. Hynek says these guys are genuine. The following day after their encounter, they went to the Singing River Hospital. They were examined by a doctor whom IRENA interviewed twice. He's since passed away, but we managed to get the doctor. They also went to Keesler Air Force Base. They'd phoned Keesler Air Force Base on the night of the abduction and been given the brush off. That's why they ended up at the sheriff's department. So they went to Keesler to be checked for radiation, which there was none. But they said, while you're here, gentlemen, why don't you tell us what happened? And we have a 17-page transcript of that interview. Unredacted, everybody's names are in it. And when Calvin's book came out. This will give you another idea of how we've worked. Calvin's book came out in 2018. A gentleman from Greece contacted me. His name is Stephanos Panagiotakis. Now, in 1981, so 8 years after the encounter, Stephanos was in the Greek Merchant Navy, and the ship it was on docked in Pascagoula. And he was also a UFO researcher and used to write for a magazine back in Greece. So I think he'd got like a week's shore leave. So he set off to try and find Charlie Hickson and get an interview, which he did. And then he went to the police station and, explained who he was and what he was doing. He said, here's a gentleman I think you should go and speak to. He was actually a clergyman, a pastor. He was called Emmanuel Sigalis. So Stephanos literally went to this gentleman's house and knocked on the door. It just so happens this pastor was also of Greek descent. So he got an interview with him. What happened that night of October the 11th, 1973, Pastor Sigalis and a chap by the name of Don Broadhurst, who worked for the police and probation department, and a young lady who was a church volunteer set off to go to a church-funded meeting for people who had problems with alcohol. As they're heading out, she sat in the back, the two gentlemen are sat in the front, and she sees this thing coming. And it literally came right across the road in front of them, heading off towards approximately where Charlie and Calvin were. It's described as being oval shaped with two lights on, which is what Charlie and Calvin described. So Stephanos got an interview with this Pastor Sigalis and sent us the transcript. He's deceased now, so was Mr. Broadhurst. But what about the young lady in the back of the car? So we did some digging and we eventually found her name. She was called Jo Ann Hallmark. And we even found an old photograph of her from 1974. She wasn't a native of Pascagoula. She'd only been there a year or two. I think she taught at the high school or whatever. And then she'd gone. So I set out on a search for her. And I found a couple of social media accounts that she'd used, but they were long since, dead. They hadn't been used in years and years and years. So I forgot about it. And then I went back again at a later time and I found a little mention on one of her social media accounts of a church. And I literally put that church name in Google and hey, presto, I found it. That church had a website. And on that website, there were a couple of sermons that you could download and listen to. And the sermons were by two gentlemen called Hallmark. And I'm thinking, is this her husband or is it her son's? So the church had an email address. So I emailed them, explained I wanted to speak to Mrs. Hallmark if she was still around. Didn't say what about. I just said she'd worked with Pastor Sigalis in 1973. About 4 weeks later, she emailed me. Said, yeah, I worked with the pastor in Pascagoula. Then I emailed her back and had to tell her then what I was really, interested in was the UFO sighting that night. And she came back and confirmed it all. I sent her the black and white photograph that we had of her. I think that brought a smile to her face. She sent us an up-to-date one and gave us her telephone details, and IRENA conducted the interview with her. And she remembered everything. But here's a lady who didn't come out of the shadows. She didn't step forward. We found her. Because some people, again, have criticized us, saying, oh, these people have come out of the shadows for their 5 minutes of fame. Well, that's not the case. Same with Mr. and Mrs. Blair. They didn't. It was their daughter that made a little remark on YouTube. And had I not seen that remark, we'd probably never got to hear about them.
Yeah, wow.
Right.
So that's how we've worked,
It's a good thing that you actually saw that remark, because that information really made Calvin stay when he found out about it, because I used it on the interview with them. Part of it I used on the interview with Calvin Parker back in November of 2021. And he said he'd never seen it before, or maybe he had, but he had forgotten. But he watched it, and it gave him validation.
Yeah, Calvin felt vindicated. It was
Yes,
almost like I told you so moment, you know.
right.
And you've shown a couple of old photographs of the area there. The area where they were fishing that night is not in the middle of some Mississippi swamp. It's right down by the highway. It was a bit of a as you can see, it was a bit of a junkyard in those days. It's all nice and clean and tidy now, and that old pier's no longer there. But it's right next to the highway. You know,
Right.
and there are buildings behind there, some that were, you know, industrial in nature, others that were not. And here you have Calvin on the left, his wife Waynette in the middle, and there you have Mrs. Maria Brer on the right, at the monument that is there now, the historical marker. This was 2019. There you go. So it's not like Roswell. You know, Roswell was in the middle of the desert. This
Right.
is not. And there were one or two people who came forward at the time back in 1973. But we also spoke to another gentleman. And again, Calvin was doing a book signing in Pascagoula. And a gentleman came up and said, yeah, can I have a book, Mr. Parker? And Waynette, you know, gave him the book. Calvin had signed it. And as he's walking away, he says, oh, I saw the UFO that night. And then he's gone. But
Wow.
luckily for us, somebody was taking photographs. So we had this photograph, this gentleman with white hair buying this book from Waynette. And I put it on social media. And a couple of days later, a lady contacted me. She said, I know who that is. I'll ask him if he'll speak to you. And she came back and she said, yeah, he will. And his name was Mr. Lewis Lee. And again, that night of October the 11th, 1973, Mr. Lee was on the opposite side of the river, but this time working. He was in the shipyard and he was a crane operator. And he says, Philip, as soon as I got in my cab, which was 10 or 12 feet off the ground, he said, I could see this damn thing out over the water, not high up in the sky, you know, out over the water. He said, I've never seen anything like it in my life, you know. And the only reason he took his eyes off it is because his colleague down below is shouting, hey, what are you doing, you know? And I said to Mr. Lee, did you tell anybody? Did you report it to anyone? He said, well, I told my family. But I said, this is 1973, Philip. There is no Ghostbusters to call, you know?
Yeah.
And he said, we all saw Charlie and Calvin being made fun of on the television, you know?
Right.
So I said, there was no way I was going to be damn fool enough to do that. But he'd now reached an age where he couldn't care less. Sadly, you know, Mr. Lee has since passed away. However, his testimony is in our book. And he's just another one who was just about his, you know, his business that night when this all happened. And again, he didn't come forward. He made a passing comment to Waynette and Calvin, and we tracked him down.
I think that the book is a real testament to some of the information that people really didn't know up to date now until they read your book. Unless you've done the research, then you would know that some of the information. I knew some of it, but I didn't know all of it. I think the story is still unraveling even now.
Well, it is.
Yeah, all the people that are coming out, the family members, everyone. IRENA, what can you add that we probably don't know yet about the book?
Well, about the book, it's beyond reasonable doubt. I don't know if it shows in there. It's on Amazon.com. There's a variety of different prices and sizes you can get, plus a recording you can play. And so it's doing well, and just go to the computer and order it.
Yeah, I hear it's approaching the top of the bestsellers list, actually.
Let's hope so. Let's hope so. What I can say to you, Tim, is that
Yes, sir.
since the book was published, I think Irene has interviewed at least 3 more witnesses that have come forward.
Wonderful.
And we have, you know, and what also happened, we kept getting the book ready, and then we'd have some more information, and then we'd have to edit it. So there come a time, I think it was August the 1st, we said, that's it, no more. That we drew a line in the sand because it was going to be published on September the 1st.
Right.
No sooner had we said that, than there was a lady in Ocean Springs called Chelsea Norton Prince. Chelsea runs the Ocean Springs Historical Society, and they have a Facebook page. And she's interested in the case. She'd met Calvin. I think she'd bought his book. And one of their members, a lady by the name of Bethany Fayard, contacted Chelsea and said, I've got 2 boxes of paperwork that used to belong to Charles Hickson. Do you want them? So she says, yes, please. What had happened, Miss Fayard's mum and dad, they bought Charlie's house in 2011 when he passed away. And these were left in the house. So she passed them on to Chelsea. Chelsea contacted me and said, do you want copies? And I said, yes, please. And whilst there's no smoking gun in them, it's a little time capsule. And for example, there's letters in there from Betty Hill to Charlie. There's letters from Bud Hopkins. What really stuck out to me, there's 2 things. One is Charlie did a pencil sketch of the UFO. That's never been seen anywhere. He did a bullet point 1 to 20 description of the creatures. You know, the nose is this big, the arms are this long. And then in it as well, there is a letter from a NASA physicist. And this NASA physicist says quite openly, I asked NASA to investigate your encounter when it happened, and they refused. They turned it down. They were not interested. So I've said, you know, NASA have launched their so-called UFO investigation last year. I hope they do a better job this time around than there was on offer then. And what also happened was the other gentleman who was involved right from the beginning was Dr. James Harder. Dr. Harder was a consultant for APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization. And they sent him down there. And, you know, we thought, well, if we could find the APRO files, surely there must be something in there. Well, the APRO files went into limbo years ago. They were down in Arizona. They were looked after by a couple of people, but nobody could get access to them. I mean, nobody. I tried, failed. At the end of last year, a chap by the name of David Marler, who's the executive director of the National UFO Historical Records Center in Albuquerque, acquired the APRO files. The gentleman who still owned them, was moving house, had no use for them, and he signed them all over to David. I've known David for a number of years, so David knew what IRENA and I were working on. In fact, he has a copy of the book. And he contacted me and says, look at these, Philip. He found 5 tape recordings of material all on the Pascagoula case from that date and that time in 1973.
Wow.
One of those recordings is Calvin Parker under hypnosis, just 3 days after the event, and is put under hypnosis by Dr. James Harder. The hypnosis lasts for about 11 minutes. Calvin was pretty upset, so they brought him out of the hypnosis. But I've transcribed it, and I think I've sent the transcript to IRENA. The rest of the stuff is literally on its way across the Atlantic as we speak. And Calvin says in this hypnosis, they ask him what these creatures look like. And it's really spooky. He says they have the face of a ghost. And it is spooky. We also have Hynek interviewing Sheriff Fred Diamond. We have Dr. James Harder conducting a press conference. And you know, so again, hugely significant historical little nuggets of information that we never even knew existed. So the case is never dead. Just when we think we know it all, something jumps out and smacks us in the face.
Okay, I was going to ask you, Philip, is this the bullet point you're talking about in regards to the description of the craft and the being?
No, that's not it at all. That's a drawing. Well,
Yeah.
basically, you've got a sheet of paper, and Charlie has gone 1 nose, so many inches long, 2,
Oh,
head.
gotcha.
So it goes from 1 to 20 like that. It's all handwritten, and then I actually have the sketch. I got a copy of it first, but I know. Yeah, there's the sketch. If you can zoom in on that, can you enlarge IRENA?
Yeah, hold on a second here. Yes, I can.
You see it?
Hold on a second, Irina.
There you go.
Yeah, we see it. Yeah.
So there's a copy, but I've got the physical pencil sketch here in a file, and
Wow.
and other things. What was also quite moving is that there were 5 letters in this collection, all addressed to Calvin Parker.
Thank you, Irina.
They were all addressed to Calvin Parker, but they didn't know his address, so they went to Charlie. And for whatever reason, Charlie never passed them on. So just before Calvin passed away in August of last year,
right,
I digitized these letters and sent them all to him because they were quite moving, Yeah. There was one lady, she apologized on behalf of the public of the USA for laughing at them when they were on television. She was absolutely disgusted by it. And so she was apologizing on behalf of everyone else, And so I have those physical copies as well, but the rest I have on all digitized. So again, just when we think, we've heard it all, hey presto, something else pops up. What is interesting, Bethany, who had these 2 boxes of letters, said she had a lot more. But some years ago, she gave them away to somebody else, and she can't remember who she gave them to, So they may turn up at some point. Yeah, you never know.
right. One thing I was going to ask you about the creatures, the 2 or 3 that came out of the ship once it landed behind them. Was it 3 or was it 2?
It was 3.
Okay, so this picture here is a representation of the 3 coming out.
Yeah.
Supposedly with elephant-like skin.
Yep.
No
Absolutely.
eyes.
No.
These things that stuck out were like what? Antennas?
Well, we've called them carrot-like or pointed appendages. We're not, not going to guess what they may or may not be. They were
Right.
bulky-looking creatures. They were about 5 feet tall, no neck, so the head was joined straight to the neck. The arms were a bit longer than ours, and they had pincer or mitten-like appendages on their where their hands would be. Their legs never moved. Their legs never moved at all. These creatures literally floated out towards them. They didn't walk, and they never made a sound, no smell, And the picture I have here is actually one that's used on the historical marker out in Pascagoula.
Right.
But that was done by a colleague of mine called Sebastian in Poland. And we submitted it to them when they were doing the marker, and he allowed them to use it, which is nice.
It's a very nice picture. In fact, it kind of shows the color of the ship itself.
Well, what Calvin and Charlie said was when they were driving up to the fishing spot, bear in mind, Calvin didn't know this location. It was Charlie. Right. They passed a no entry sign, and Calvin wasn't happy with that. And Charlie said, "Oh, don't take any notice." So they set up fishing on the pier, and then these blue lights came from behind them. And Calvin's first thought was, "It's the police. We're going to spend the night in jail for trespassing."
Right.
But of course, when they turn around, it wasn't the police. And
Right.
Calvin said the light was so intense that, especially when this opening appeared, They literally had to shield their eyes. And that's why they had difficulty estimating the size of this thing, because they were dazzled by the light. Same when they went inside. Calvin said this, he said the light just came out of the paint. In other words, it just came out of the walls. And it was very bright. You couldn't make out any features or anything like that. And so when they gave estimates of how big this thing was, they were guessing really, because it blinded them. And
Right.
Calvin said he felt like a mark on his eyes for a couple of days later, like you do if you saw somebody welding. You didn't have a welder's mask, Like when we all look at a bright light and we get the after effect for a minute or two. Calvin had that for a few days. And of course, the big difference between Charlie and Calvin's on-board encounter is that Calvin encountered this female. She was pretty much human looking, apart from the middle fingers on her hand were a lot longer. And she did some bad things to Calvin that he didn't like talking about. And, he got hold of her at one point and wanted to punch the lights out, but he didn't get the chance, I'm afraid. But what is also part of the research that we did, Tim, I mean, people must now think when they get an email from me, I think, oh my God, no, not Mantle again. I know what he's going to ask. But we found out that Calvin had another encounter in 1993, and he had gone under hypnosis with the late Bud Hopkins.
Right.
We also found out that Charlie Hickson had visited Bud Hopkins twice in different years. I think it was 85 and 89. I may be wrong on those dates, but they were a few years apart. And it also went under hypnosis. And we managed to find the tape recordings of those.
Wow.
And we have them. And we also had the opportunity to put Calvin under hypnosis 2 more occasions, one with Kathleen Marden and one with a local hypnotherapist in 2022, when we also put Mrs. Blair under hypnosis. And what is interesting about the time that Mrs. Blair went under hypnosis, we literally hired a local hypnotherapist, a professional, nothing to do with this subject matter. We did not tell her what the subject was. We just gave her a date, a time, and a location. And we had it filmed professionally. And when you see some of the film, you see this hypnotherapist, when Maria starts talking about things, you see her eyes light up, thinking, oh my God, So we've, again, we found more and more information. I found another recording of Charlie under hypnosis with Dr. Leo Sprinkle, who has since passed away. And we have that recording as well. So,
I was going to ask, do you have the recording of Charles Hickson on his deathbed talking to Calvin Parker? Because Calvin told me when he was going to come back on the second time, if he felt better, which of course he never did, he was going to release that recording he had of Charles Hickson talking on his deathbed.
No, don't have that. What we do know is, speaking to Eddie Hickson, he's got some boxes of old photographs of his dad. But he also said, I've got some videotapes, old VHS videotapes. No idea what's on them. I mean, none. Because who today has a video player, So we've been trying, but unsuccessfully, to obtain these videotapes from Charlie, because it's from Eddie. I mean, Charlie did a number of TV shows, and we've not been able to get them. He was on the Dick Cavett show, the Mike Douglas show, and we just wondered if they might be on one of these videotapes.
That'd be nice if you could get a hold of that. I do know that the recording that I was in reference to should be in the possession of Calvin's wife. Yeah,
if it's on his computer, then we'll well, I don't think we'll ever get access to it, but I will certainly ask Waynette. You know, I certainly will.
Yeah, because Calvin brought it up to me, and I just wanted to know if you had that. Anyways, yeah. All right, let's go down the panel and see if anybody has questions. Odessa.
I just think it's very interesting that even to this day, there's new information coming out about the incident, that there's, new things that are being discovered. And I think it's fascinating to me to hear, personal recounts and of like, IRENA talking about the interview that she did. And I'm really enjoying just kind of listening. I don't really have a lot of questions. I'm just really enjoying the interview. So thank you so much.
Well, I think in the book, somebody asked me how many witnesses are in the book. And at the time I didn't know. So I got out a copy and I thought I better count these,
Yeah.
and I think there's somewhere around 40-ish,
Right. Kind of hard to argue with that many witnesses.
Well, what Irena and I decided to do is whatever information we obtained, we would publish it, and we allow the reader to draw their own conclusion. So we haven't hidden anything. We know, for example, that there's a debate about the use of hypnosis. Some say it's useful, some say it's not. So, okay, we understand that, but what we'll do, we'll publish what hypnosis material we've found, and you draw your own conclusion.
Exactly.
I asked Calvin about hypnosis. I said, "Would it of any use to you, Calvin?" He says, "No." I said, "Why?" He says, "Because I remembered it all anyway,
Yeah.
So,
waking memory.
but what is also apparent to me, Odessa, is if you look at the things with the government hearings, NASA's public address, the latest from the behind the closed door skiff about all things, you will find no mention in any of this with whistleblower David Grush,
Right.
etc. You will find no mention of abductions whatsoever.
Not a single
I mean,
one.
not a sniff. Now, I think that's on purpose. I think they are purposely editing an aspect of the UFO phenomena out of the narrative simply because it's difficult to talk to. Because if these gentlemen all believe that we are being visited by beings from another world, then it's very difficult then to say they're trying to get the government to release whatever. But they would then have to go to the government and say, "Oh, while we're at it, you better tell us why you're allowing our citizens to be abducted by these creatures." And it doesn't fit their narrative. So you find no mention about it whatsoever. Absolutely none at all. And I think that's just not cricket, shall we say?
Right.
But I think Nancy Timms would have something to add to that.
I'm curious. They went for testing for radiation effects. What happened? What event made them suspicious of being radiation exposed?
Well, Calvin, as they got home that night after the encounter, he took all of his clothes, put them in a bag, and put it in the dumpster. He then got in the shower with a bottle of bleach and washed himself in bleach. They went into work the next day thinking nobody knew about it. The sheriff said, "I'm not going to tell anybody," but somehow the story got out. There was journalists there, etc., etc. They were sent to the Singing River Hospital for a checkup, and they were fine. And I think it might have been Calvin, or it might have even been the sheriff. Somebody said, "What about radiation?" And of course, the hospital couldn't check for that, so the sheriff's department actually took them in a car to Keesler. And in these recent tapes that have just turned up, Hynek is asking about this with the interview with Sheriff Fred Diamond. And he says, these guys, meaning the people at Keesler, were already waiting for us when we got there. We'd phoned ahead. They were all set up, and they just run the Geiger counter over them, and it just gave a blank. But then, of course, it gave the officials at Keesler the opportunity to then interview them, whereas the night before they'd given them the brush off. And like I said, we have that that interview. It's 17 pages long, I believe, and there's nobody. All the officials, all the Air Force people are all named on it, you know. So it was just like I think it was like an off the cuff comment that somebody just mentioned it and thought, oh,
Yeah.
well, why
Well,
not?
that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Nos, what is your take on all this?
My take is that I find most interesting the parallels with Roswell, because what we're looking at is that real significant incidents leave footprints. The truth doesn't want to hide. So with the Roswell incident, we just have over and over another witness comes forward, someone else with some more documentations. And the truth wants to be found. It wants to be uncovered. And, thinking in those terms, that's something that happens with legitimate circumstances like that. And, makes for interesting contemplation when you think about a lot of the other big claims that have come out of left field with nary a trickle of anything that follows.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of our authors is Kevin Randall. One of the main Roswell researchers. I published one of Kevin's books last year called Understanding Roswell. And as far as we are aware, all those that were at Roswell at the time are all now deceased, But there's the big difference between Roswell and Pascagoula. Most of the people, sadly not Calvin anymore, but most of the others are still around.
Yeah.
We had Maria Blair go on camera for an interview at the end of last year, and again it was our friend Chelsea out in Ocean Springs, and she added some little extra tidbits. She thinks she'd seen the UFO again in recent times, and she explained, because we'd never got the opportunity to sit her down and say, right, here's some questions for you, Maria. They were always done by the TV station or somebody else. So now we had the opportunity to do that. And she said from her vantage point, she saw what happened to Charlie and Kelvin, not just a blue light coming down and flying around, but this thing come down. She thought it was men that were doing this. She said, I was totally befuddled. I had no idea what was going on. And then this thing happened to us, scared the living daylights out of her.
Yeah.
And then it went, and then she saw what happened to Charlie and Calvin on the TV, and she added the two things together and thought, oh my God, that's what I saw, but from a distance, but, and when her husband came back offshore from working on the oil rigs, he said, don't say a word. And when we go back to that comment that Mrs. Blair's, as it turned out, her youngest daughter left on YouTube, it said, my mum and dad were on the opposite side of the river that night, and they too saw the UFO. But that's all she said. They told the two daughters about seeing this thing, but not the rest of the stuff. So they even kept it from their own daughters, who are now grown up, of course. So we made a documentary last year. Irena and I are consultants on it, where we've been interviewed for it. It'll come out at some point this year, but sadly we couldn't get Maria Blair on camera. She was just busy with other things. We just couldn't. We had a window of opportunity while the film crew were in the States. They're from the UK, and Maria wasn't available. But we now have her on video. What is also interesting, when we go back to Maria's deceased husband, Jerry, he was in hospital very poorly, and he didn't know if it was going to, last much longer. So he made Irena phone me from the hospital. And he told us for the first time, Mr. Mantle, he said, I lied. I saw the same as my wife, Maria. I saw this, that, and the other. And not only that, Maria filmed it on her cell phone. And we have that film. It's only just over a minute long. So you have Mr. Blair sat on his hospital bed, still with stickers on him and things like that, telling us what had happened, and it's very moving. He told the rest of the story, as Irena pointed out, before he went on a ventilator. So it's almost like a deathbed confession, but it didn't happen in a few minutes. It was spread over a small period of time. And that's
Right.
never been, we have the text of that in our book, but the actual video and the audio, we've never released anywhere, even though Maria gave us permission to do so. But what I do have on Facebook is a little edited 5-minute piece of Maria Blair from the interview we did at the last year, just talking about what she witnessed that night of Charlie and Calvin. And I would recommend anyone to listen to it. It's only 5 minutes long, and it's a video as well, so you can see it.
Right.
So you don't have to believe me. You can listen to what Maria says in her own words.
I remember her saying something about seeing the creature, one of the elephant skin creatures underneath the water, moving underneath the water.
Yeah,
And that's
yeah.
what freaked her out the most was.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Well, it would me.
Yeah, for sure.
Not Irena being with the Defence Intelligence Agency. I'm sure they briefed her on all these things, you know, and her husband working at Area 51. Come on.
Yeah, she's got the connections, Irena does. I want to go to Nicole. Nicole, what's your take on this?
I wanted to go back. I kind of, Philip had mentioned something before when you were addressing David Grush and like why Congress and maybe them taking parts or leaving parts out. But I kind of wanted to tell you when I interviewed Rick Doty, he said that Congress, according to United States Code 93939, I would have to double check that, but that prevents US UFO disclosure to Congress and Senate. They do not have the security clearance, is what they're saying. And he said, I said, so when they're identified and they're no longer UAP UFO, they're an IAC or an IEC categorized. So that might be, I mean, I don't know what they're doing with Congress or how, or even the Senate or how with this going on, but it's smoke and mirrors.
Well, I'm not necessarily talking about Congress. I'm talking about I call them the disclosure lobby.
Mm-hmm. So
you have Grush, Corbell, and several others. We're all well known, and they're all
right.
well-meaning, I'm sure. But none of them, none of those, and they're not bound by any security oath, you know. Then, you know, and as for Mr. Grush being a whistleblower tells everything. You don't tell bits and pieces and then say, "Oh, I can't tell you the rest." You know,
Right.
It's like giving you half of your dinner and said, if you had the other half, you'd have really enjoyed it. You know, if you look at Edward Snowden, you know, well-known whistleblower, he told the lot and provided the documents, and to the hell with it. That is a whistleblower.
And he has to hide over in Russia. You know, it's like, so I tend to think some of these whistleblowers are planted for a particular reason.
But who knows? I mean, and again, as for Rick Doty, I wouldn't believe a word he says. You know, he was in league with William Moore many years back, who left the subject in disgrace for feeding disinformation into the UFO subject.
Absolutely.
So, you know, and I would guarantee that the security code that he gave you is just gibberish and made up. I'll give you a security code. It's called Philip 123. There you go.
It is. I did check into it.
I'll tell you, a whistleblower that's in England is Gary McKinnon.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, he's hiding, isn't he? Too.
Yeah, but again, you know, and again, no disrespect to Mr. McKinnon. He's supposed to be some supercomputer geek, right? You know, and he can hack NASA, but yeah, he doesn't have a print screen. You know, I can save screen and screen save. I've got all this UFO stuff on, and my laptop or whatever he was using doesn't allow me to do a screen save. You know, that's you know.
Yeah, that didn't make sense when he said it was printing it out line by line. Why didn't he save it? I don't understand that either.
Yeah. But again, he's not gone to prison, has he? He's not gone to prison. He's a free man. I know they wanted to extradite him, but fair enough. This young lady's putting her finger up. It's only one.
Irena, what were you holding up? What was the book you were holding up, Irena?
This is by Doty and Robert Collins, and I interviewed his co-author, Doty's.
Hold on a second again. Can you hold it up again, Irena?
And
okay.
I didn't know who he was at the time, but we had a long interview with him at Wright-Patterson. And I don't think people trust Doty very far.
No, not at all.
Now I know he's counterintelligence, but you always get nuggets of truth. So he's been coming out. Yeah, I don't know. He wants to take this disclosure over. So
Well,
whether or
good-
not or
good
how
luck
he
with
does
that.
it or whatever. Yeah, you never know with him.
I've actually heard that Rick Doty is concerned with counterintelligence, but
That he is concerned. What do you mean?
well, he's involved with counterintelligence.
Yeah.
And the fact that he's spreading disinformation and misinformation, and it's very hard to find the nuggets of truth. But I don't know.
Yeah,
Now
Colin,
he's saying he's going back and kind of back on it. But yes, go on, Irene. I apologize.
yeah, Colin said that in order to get people to pay attention to the disinformation, they put a little bit of information in, and then the rest of it's disinformation. That makes it people get interested and put it in the papers and everything.
Yeah.
I agree with you, Irina. I do. I think a lot of it is. So it's weeding through. Instead of trying to figure out, I always try to figure out where the truth is. And you gotta sift through a lot of information. But as I'm
Always,
saying,
But
always.
the
let you
interview was
think-
really spooky. The interview I had with,
I was going to
the
say,
interview-
go ahead.
Oh, the interview I had with Collins was real spooky because two of us were to interview him, and we went to this restaurant. We were supposed to meet him and ate and everything, and we didn't see a thing of him. And then we got up to leave, and suddenly he just appeared and grabbed us.
oh wow.
The whole thing was spooky. And I had met him by advertising in the Skywriter, the Wright-Patterson newspaper, and so he had some access to that. He said he was working for Wright-Patterson, but I don't know if he was.
Well, even if he might have been, it created conversation,
True.
right? All I know is this: there's a lot of disinformation and misinformation out there from some of the people who are claiming to be, let's say, people that are trying to push forward the disclosure or transparency issue. One of who is a good friend of mine, by the way, Lou Elizondo, worked in counterintelligence. And so he is questioned all the time whether he is still active in that area. So you never know who's actually spreading the truth and who isn't. I personally believe that ever since the original UFO hearing came out in the United States, they've slammed the lid down on releasing any type of real credible information to the public. And the only way that we're going to get information is from people like us.
Yeah.
Well, that's long since been my argument, Tim. UFO groups around the world surely have enough information. Like all the information Irena and I have obtained about Pascagoula, was done from our living rooms, pretty much. We didn't need some huge governmental budget behind us to do that. And again, let's be honest about the 3 Navy videos that came out in 2017, the Go Fast, the Gimbal, and whatever, the Tic Tac. I mean, they were filmed by Top Gun Navy pilots flying aircraft that cost over $100 million each. But yet all we get is 3 fuzzy blobs. And we complain about people contacting us with their cell phone film, which is of fuzzy blobs, because but yeah, your cell phone will cost a couple of $100, not 100 million plus,
Yeah.
So from a civilian UFO research point of view, I don't see that we've got anything less than any government department can have. And if you look at the Arrow website that's up and running, they're starting to go through some of the observations that have been reported to them, and they're saying this so many percent is now identified. But there are those out there, and again, they're in the disclosure lobby, that will tell you that if you are a military pilot or a military aviator or even a civilian aviator, if you report a UFO sighting, then you have to take it as read. Well, here we have Arrow, who are seemingly concentrating just on military personnel, and they've already identified a number of things. So, I spoke to, he's no longer with us, but a squadron leader here in the UK who'd had recorded 6 UFOs over mainland Britain. He was the head of military radar in the UK. And, there's nobody stopping him telling me, he didn't get in any trouble for it when he did tell me. He lived a happy and long life. But if he'd have told the MOD, they would have got the same story from him that I got. No difference. So
Right.
I'm not convinced that, they've got that much more to disclose than we don't already know ourselves. But we'll see. We'll see. I may well be wrong.
Yeah, it seems funny to me that even people who have had, say, close-up UFO sightings or have been experiencers, turn to the government for validation, which
Right.
I'd have to say, honestly, when have you ever believed your government? I have never believed our government. Okay, so if they come out and say something and say, "Oh, by the way, we've been hiding UFOs for the last 80 some years, and we've been hiding alien life, and that we've been interacting with them on Earth and in space. And oh, by the way, did you know that we've reverse engineered technology that takes us to the stars?" It's like, if they were to tell us that, I don't know if I'd believe them.
Well, that's a good point there, Tim, because as we all know, whatever the UFO phenomenon may be, it knows no international borders. It is a worldwide phenomenon. So let's assume, for sake of argument, we are being visited by creatures not of this earth.
Right.
And if that information was going to be released to the general public, who would do it? Now, bear in mind, this is an international phenomenon.
Yeah.
So would it be the United Nations, for example? Not a lot of. Well, there you go. The silence says, well, United Nations, you got to be joking. Because they're looked upon as being pretty much a talking shop and never really get a great deal done.
Yeah.
Would it be the President of the United States?
I don't think so.
Well, there you
No,
go.
he's a temp worker.
You've got Joe Biden, who some people like. Other people say, he can hardly stay awake. He's that old. His predecessor, Mr. Trump, has his own problems. So
Yeah.
would
They're all politicians. That's their problem.
would it be the Pope?
Exactly.
Now, the Pope only represents a small percentage of Christian beliefs. And of course, if the Pope said it, well, the Anglicans wouldn't believe it, the Protestants, and what about all the other religions that don't, are not Christian? So and it goes on, I look at our Prime Minister that we had, Boris Johnson, my God, I'm not even sure I believe that's his real name.
Somebody just mentioned Justin Trudeau. Yeah, he's not doing it either.
I mean, in fact, we want to make him an American citizen, so you can have him.
No.
You can keep him. You can keep him.
I personally,
We have enough. We're good.
I personally believe there isn't a person alive on Earth that is capable of being a representative of the entire planet
Exactly.
when we meet someone.
Exactly. So if we're talking about disclosure, then what we've just said is there is nobody to disclose it. Nobody that would convince us.
Right.
Might convince some of us. And again, the disclosure lobby they're not looking for disclosure.
No.
They're looking for people to confirm their belief in alien visitors. I'm not saying they're wrong, but if it turned out to be something else and there was a big hoo-ha made of it, and the United Nations and the various presidents all congregated there and said, we've looked at the UFO subject and this is what it is, but it's not aliens. Those people in disclosure lobby would say they're lying. As simple as that. They want to have their own beliefs confirmed. And it's almost and this is no disrespect to anybody that has religious beliefs. It's almost like a religious belief. You know, I believe in this, and I want you to confirm it. You know,
Right.
And it's not going to happen. You know, we've pointed out some of the reasons why now. There isn't one voice that could convince us all. You know, no matter what it is, I may be wrong.
I've always said that if a spacecraft, and a legitimate spacecraft of some kind, non-human intelligence spacecraft, were to crash on the White House lawn, and it made the news, it was on all the world cameras, right? And everybody saw it. Within a week, people would be questioning it.
Oh,
saying,
listen,
"Not
it
really."
Tim, it won't even last that long. I was on my way from England to Laughlin, Nevada, to a UFO conference.
Mhm.
And while we were en route with a friend of mine, we changed aircraft in New York. And it's when the space shuttle burnt up on re-entry. We were watching it in the airport just after it had happened. By the time we changed aircraft, got to Laughlin, to the hotel where the UFO conference was being held, we're queuing up to book in. I said to my friend, let's have a listen. And the conspiracy theories had already started. And this is within a couple of hours. You know, the way I look at things, rightly or wrongly, differently. I go back to Roswell. Because if we have to believe what we're told about Roswell, it was released. You know, there was a press release sent out, flying discs, blah, blah. And then within hours, the lid was put on it.
Right.
How did we recognize, A, that this was extraterrestrial in the first place?
Right.
And B, how did we recognize within hours that this was a threat of some kind, such a threat that the lid had to be clamped on it then and has been kept clamped on it ever since?
Right.
You know, and I've asked all the main UFO Roswell researchers, including Stanton Friedman, before he passed away, what scared them into, as Stanton called me, you know, initiating the cosmic Watergate. They put, and I couldn't get a straight answer from none of them. You know, the way I look at it is the other way around. The president at the time was Harry Truman. You know, he dropped the atomic bomb on the Japanese. You know, he was probably riding pretty good in the opinion polls. And you know what politicians are like? You know, they like to be remembered, don't they? They don't like to go out. If I'd have been Harry Truman and Roswell was an alien vehicle, I would have been on the first newscast I could get my face on and saying, you know, we made first contact today. Unfortunately, it's ended in disaster. The aliens have crashed, but they didn't crash in Russia, did they? They came to America first. and via your back, and like they did with the Cuban Missile Crisis, via back channels, they could have fed information into Russia and said, not only have we got our nukes, guys, you better look and see what these guys have brought with them, you know, so you better you better watch it, bozo, you know. But that didn't, you know, but according to the various researchers, that didn't happen. The lid was clamped on and it's been kept in place ever since. You know, I
think a lot of skeptics or people that call themselves skeptics within the UFO community itself drives the negative narrative right after the story breaks on what happens with a UFO sighting or an alien experience or whatever. I think it's the skeptics that are pushing the negative narrative. And they say, oh, we're open-minded. No, you're not. And the thing about it is I'm trying to get people with this channel, just like you are with your books.
Yeah.
And Irena, with your experiences and your books and things of that nature, we're all trying to get the information out there and let people decide for themselves, because that's the only way they're going to know for sure within themselves is what is true.
Yeah, well, Irena had her hand up. I think she's going to tell me I'm wrong now. Go on. What were you going to say, Irena?
No, when I worked for the DIA, you were talking about photography. Well, they obviously have a spy in the sky satellite that photographs from up above the whole Earth all the time. And so they probably have pictures of UFOs and probably good videos. But when I worked there, I don't think my supervisors had any higher clearances than I did, and they didn't know anything about UFOs. But I think somebody does because somebody has that photography.
Yeah,
Mhm.
it's a very
Right.
good point.
I actually did an interview with James Fox, and he's a filmmaker, and he deals with UFO sightings and alien. I think the last thing he did was on the Virginia UFO crash in Brazil. He told me in the interview that now, what I just lost my train of thought. In regards to what you just said, Philip, what were you just saying?
Well, I think what you're going to say about James Fox are two things. When it came to Virginia, he said he thinks he knows where there's film of it, of the actual incident or the creature or whatever. He also claims that, you know, there's a fabled piece of film that's been made of a UFO. I forget the gentleman's name and where it, but James claims he's seen it. Well, okay. What I was always taught, if somebody makes a claim, show me.
Prove it.
It's like the film Jerry Maguire. Show me the money. You know, put your cards on the table. You know, no disrespect. You know, I know James. I've met him, and but you're going to put your cards on the table, because if that's the case, anybody can claim anything. If we just accept claims, we can all say I've seen. It's like I was involved with the biggest UFO hoax in UFO history. That was the alien autopsy film. And I've been talking to the perpetrator of this hoax, Ray Santilli, for about a year and a half. And I told him to get lost because he'd just been telling me a story. Then he said, I've got some film. So I went to London to his office and demanded he put the film on the table. And he did. It just happened to be a hoax. But I called him out. You claim to have this film, you show me. You know, or you claim to have these documents, you show me. You know,
Right,
Yeah,
that's the proof. Yeah. But the thing that bothers me about today's technology, the proof can be tampered with so easily.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when it comes to UFO photographs or film, if I receive any, I automatically think, right, I'm going to treat this as if it's a fake. And I'll work backwards from that. And most of them are just lights in the sky with a cell phone. It could be any damn thing, you know.
Right.
But going back to Pascagoula, that's the only thing that we've not been presented with. I've talked to IRENA about it, and I mentioned it to Calvin. We've not had a piece of film or a photograph as yet. And of course, it was celluloid in those days was the film, and it was the old, you know, the old 35mm cameras and so on. But that would never surprise me, and I would treat it exactly the same. If somebody did say, I've got this picture, I would be very suspicious and work backwards from that and see what happened. But of course, one of the things we've not discussed is an incident that's relevant today, but it happened at Pascagoula on November the 6th, 1970, 4 weeks after Charlie and Calvin's incident, in the same part of the river, just a little bit further out. What happened that night is there were 3 little skiffs, 3 little boats went out fishing with nets, and they saw something under the water. It was circular, about 30 feet in diameter. It was in sections, and it was illuminated from underneath. And one of these little skiffs got so close to it, they could hit it with an oar, and it went clunk. And they played cat and mouse with this around this river. They then went to the Coast Guard station in person and reported it. The Coast Guard sent a boat out. They too saw it. They too hit it, and it went clunk. And we have in our book the full story of this and all the official Coast Guard documents. Again, all unredacted. And in those documents is the names of the civilian witnesses. A colleague of mine said, do you know so-and-so has got a photograph of those witnesses? Okay. Yeah. So I emailed him. The next day, what the Coast Guard did, they lined all the witnesses up on the quayside and took a colour photograph of them. And on their back, on the back of the photo, is all their names and their ages. So IRENA and I got stuck into this, and we put this photograph again on social media. Within 2 or 3 hours, a lady had contacted me and said they're all dead apart from one. And I think she said the one remainder was related to, I think it was a father-in-law, but she was related by marriage somehow. We got his name, Mr. Earl Ryan, got his telephone number, passed it on to IRENA. IRENA, what did Mr. Ryan have to say about the USO scene in Pascagoula?
Well, he said that if I were there, he could take me right out then and show me exactly where it happened. And it was very, very close to where the abduction was. And he was 16 at the time with his father, and they saw it, and they tried to figure out what it was. And like his father hit it with an oar, and I asked him how they could do that. He said it had a real long oar, but it sounded metallic and stuff. And then the other people saw it, and if they hassled it, its light would go out, and then it might appear someplace else, and they would go out to where that was. And sometimes the light was really bright, and it was a really strange light. But after a while, he and his father went in to get the Coast Guard, and the Coast Guard came out, and they looked at it too. And they said this light from it, the one man that wrote it up said that the light from it was really strange, because if he put an oar out over the light, it would go right through there. There wouldn't be a shadow or anything. And so it seemed like strange light. But another thing that was odd is that this happened just about where the abduction happened, but they hassled Calvin and Charlie like crazy, but they were very serious and respectful about this USOs they saw in the water. And the Coast Guard interviewed people and handled it like it was a real investigation and seriously, which contrasted a lot about all the hasslement that Charlie and Calvin got.
Yeah, and in the Coast Guard documents, it says the object remains unidentified. And there was a guy came out the next day from the Navy. That supposedly the Navy were going to issue a report, but we've never seen that report. It may exist, but what we have today, of course, with some of the sightings made by the Navy people, were things going under the water. So it's now become in vogue, so to speak, is the underwater objects. Whereas we have one way back in 1973 at Pascagoula, and to read the Coast Guard documents is fascinating, and Mr. Ryan to remember it like, it was yesterday. So all that is in our book, including that interview with Mr. Ryan, who was there in person. But again, people have said, well, this is irrelevant. It happened a couple of weeks later. Well, our argument that it's not. It was in the same location, It's almost like a burglar going back to burgle the same house, That happens. Sometimes criminals return to the scene of the crime,
Mm-hmm.
But again, we've put that in the book, and the readers can see it all. Again, all the documents are unredacted. There's even a letter from one of the Coast Guard people to the late Leonard Stringfield. A handwritten letter describing what happened and a couple of little drawings of what they saw as well. And it's a fascinating, often missed aspect of this Pascagoula case. We tend to concentrate on what happened that night with Charlie and Calvin for obvious reasons, but the case is much, much bigger than that, much larger than that. There are a lot of other things going on in and around the area, and the Coast Guard and the fishermen sighting under the water. I think it fascinates me, really does.
Okay, we're going to go around the panel, starting with Nancy Pims. What is your last comment, Nancy?
I have more of a question.
Okay.
I was just wondering, in your research and in this field of ufology, how do you perceive, or what is your perception of how the public is absorbing all this?
Yeah, it's obviously difficult to say that, Nancy. I mean, I've been involved a long time, and the public interest in this subject goes in peaks and troughs. We know that. For example, in the 1990s, we had the X-Files TV series, beamed into everybody's living room. And like it or not, that spilled out into the serious side of research as well. From an abduction point of view, in the 90s, we have Dr. John Mack, a Harvard professor, a Pulitzer Prize winning gentleman as well, step into the limelight and say, look, there's something serious happening to these people here. It's not any psychological or psychiatric manifestation that I have ever come across. Therefore, it must be something else. What else could it be? And so that, from my point of view, increased public awareness, and the media took it more serious as well, because it's largely the media that influences public perception. So even with the 3 fuzzy films by the US Navy, it went in the New York Times. It was written up in a serious and respectful manner, even if you disagree with some of the things that were said. From a public perception, it's been very good for the subject. I think the New York Times said it's their highest rated online article ever, and that says something about it. So then you have the hearings and NASA and so on. Again, that can only influence public perception. And I think it's in a good place at this time. We'll go back to Calvin and Charlie. They were ridiculed back in 1973, but when Calvin published his book in 2018, it's totally different. Nobody ridiculed him. Nobody laughed at him. They treated him with respect. And it ended up with the town of Pascagoula, a charity there, raising enough money to put a historical marker at the place, which was unveiled by the mayor. So the town have now absorbed the Pascagoula case into their history and folklore, which is only a good thing. And they want to do more, but it's a question of money, of course.
Yeah.
Okay, Odessa.
As always, I just want to say thank you so much to both of our guests. We've really enjoyed having you here. I wish I could have heard a little bit more from Irena, but that's okay. Philip did warn us he likes to talk. So thank you guys both very much for being here. It's been wonderful just to listen. It's been fascinating. So just thank you.
I might do most of the talking, but Irena's told me beforehand what I've got to say.
There you go. As long as you got the script, you're good.
Nos.
I wanted to ask Irena. You were talking about the sounds, the acoustic events that happen around these, and I wondered if you have gotten a copy of the recording from the St. Helens encounter.
No.
Okay. If you hang around after the show, I'll make sure to get a copy to you, because I have the audio recording itself.
I think I've heard that, the St. Helens encounter. I think I have it in a little file just on its own. And if I remember serving right, there was a noise. Was there a police officer involved?
Yeah, I was a police officer involved, and when he came up on the ship and heard the noise it was making, he actually queued up his CB radio and he called back
and they recorded it. Yeah,
and told them, you need to break out the recording equipment and you need to record this. And he kept his CB queued, listening to the craft.
Irena, just tell them for reference how big the sound was, how far it spread across the United States.
Well, I did research on the papers. At that time, there were sonic booms, and this was so different that it made headlines all across the United States, even though there's sonic booms. It started in Iowa and finished at the coast near Washington, D.C., where the last reports were. It went across the country, and it was on 2 seismographs so that I could calculate the speed and everything else from that. And it was as much as, it went, about 1,000 miles east and west generally. It was about 500 miles wide in places. So it was just huge. And nobody had any explanation at all. They couldn't find anything to account for it.
Right.
I got a question about that then. A lot of vehicles, they say now that are seen speeding off, don't leave a sonic boom.
Well, this
So
Oh,
Would
this
that-
was,
Sorry,
this was
go ahead.
explained as a earth-grazing meteor, but I could calculate the speed, and it definitely wasn't escape velocity or anything, so it wasn't that, and that was the main explanation.
It was nice to know what that was. Very interesting. Nicole,
Irina, I think that is absolutely fascinating. I have a background in aviation also. I would love to hear more, maybe bring you back to as a guest, because I think you've got so much information about this. Are either one of you an experiencer of the phenomenon? And I guess I also wanted to ask what your thoughts were that maybe since disclosure doesn't seem like it's so going like appropriately, or there's not appropriate responses, maybe because humanoid extraterrestrials already live among us and are in control of that, or they're infiltrated, I guess.
Well,
Right.
I'll let Irene tell about being an experiencer, but it's coincidental that you mentioned that last bit. When Mrs. Blair was put under hypnosis, there's a big gap between the hypnotherapist asking her a question and she replying. She's quite upset at points. But she says that these beings were interested in her eggs and DNA. And the reason for that was that they want to create beings that can walk amongst us unidentified. They look just like us. And she said that under hypnosis, and again, in our book, we have the full transcript of that hypnosis session. And, we didn't expect any of that at all. We're all startled by what she said. And also, she went on subsequently to say that she believed that her husband and Jerry were the target for the abduction that night and not Charlie and Calvin. And the reason she believes that is because her and Mr. Blair were due to be at that location at that time. He was catching a boat out to go out into the Gulf. Whereas Charlie and Calvin were driving home from work that night, and it was only on their drive home that they said, "Do you want to go fishing tonight, son?" "Oh yeah, that's a good idea." They weren't in the plans. So she looks upon Charlie and Calvin have almost been like collateral damage, But Irena's the only one that had out of the two of us had a UFO experience of any worth. I'm sure she'll tell you a bit more about it.
Well, I probably am an experiencer, and I've had several experiences,
Mhm.
and they were all with other people. And so it wasn't like I'm insane because the other people saw the same thing I did. In fact, I had one with a bunch of professors. And I probably have missing time. And my sister and I may have had two experiences where we had missing time. But a lot of people like Maria and Calvin and everybody get hypnotized and they tell all this information. Well, hypnosis doesn't work on me at all. I mean, it has absolutely nothing. I've tried, Bed Hopkins hypnotized me and I didn't undergo hypnosis or anything else. So I don't have, all these things about talking to aliens or anything else that other people have, but I am an experiencer and I have other people that will confirm it.
Oh, absolutely. I could sense that about you, but definitely just from your perspective.
I was going to say in regards to hypnosis, they tried to hypnotize me too, and I can't go under as well. They say it's people with a very active mind who can't slow down their thoughts can't be hypnotized.
Well, let me just tell you a little story here. When Calvin was on board this thing, he believes he was laid down on a transparent table of some description. He couldn't feel anything, and he was laid at an angle. Charlie said he was just suspended. Now, a few years back, I had trouble sleeping, and I went eventually to a local hypnotherapist, and he put me under hypnosis. On the last, I had 4 sessions with him. The last session, basically, is he's got a room where he practices in his house, beautiful room, big leather chair. This chair is all electronically controlled, so you could alter it to just so you were, headphones on, a little monitor on your finger, and he put me under hypnosis. And I have to say, I got to the stage where I could not even feel the chair underneath me, you know. And when Calvin is telling me about his hypnosis experience, his encounter experience where he's laid back on this thing and he couldn't feel anything underneath him, it twigged with me. It just felt exactly the same. Now, I'm not saying the aliens hypnotized Calvin. All I'm saying is it just sounded like the same thing to me, you know. And,
Right.
you know, I've never known any. I wish I could sleep like that now. You know, I still have problems sleeping, but so I've never been under regressive hypnosis, but I have been under hypnosis.
Very interesting.
I've actually been offered to go under regressive hypnosis because I've awakened with marks on my body as well. And I have a mark that still exists on my chest since 2009. January 1st, 2009, actually. And it's a round welt with 5 puncture wounds in the circle. And I had a doctor check it out, and they thought it was a vaccination mark. But I told them I don't have any medical records indicating that I had a vaccination in the middle of my chest. And they went and checked my medical records, and they confirmed it. So this happened overnight. So what I'm going to say to you is I need to be regressed, but I don't know if that's a possibility because I tried regular hypnosis and it didn't work. So, you know.
Yeah, well, you know, when it comes to hypnosis, you know, down the years I've learned that it's down to the individual. You know,
Right.
When I was part of Buford, we weren't allowed to use hypnosis, and I understand why, but I always left it to the individual anyway. And it is an individual thing. Like Calvin said, he said no use to him really at all because he remembered it all, you know. But he did it because, you know,
Right.
it was the done thing. But what we did do when the last hypnosis Calvin had was after Mrs. Blair. And it's the same hypnotherapist. And I sent her some questions this time. And I said, ask Calvin, before he sees anything, he's just standing on this little pier with his fishing rod, looking out into the water, just to describe the scene in front of him. So she does. And we have this on film. And he says, yeah, there's the bridge there with, you know, some traffic going over it. There's a little boat going out to sea. And he can even tell me the name of the boat, you know, the company name. And right at the end, he says, oh, there's 2 figures on the opposite side of the river. Now, those 2 figures, Mr. and Mrs. Blair, or is it somebody else? I don't know. I have no way of knowing. But if you don't listen to it properly, I would have missed that, you know?
Right.
And it just makes me curious. Was it the Blairs or was it somebody else? And if it's somebody else, there are other witnesses.
Or maybe it was a couple more beings from the craft.
Well, I didn't want to say that, but you that's you reading the book. That's the questions I want people to ask.
Right. We had a lot of engagement in the chat room tonight. I want to thank everybody who participated in the chat room. Again, I want to reiterate before I thank everybody on the panel, I want to reiterate that the book that IRENA and Philip Mantle wrote together, co-authored together, is called Beyond Reasonable Doubt. It is available on Amazon. Please pick up a copy. Get yours today.
It's free on Amazon Kindle. Just so you all know, it's free on Amazon Kindle.
If you want to get it signed, perhaps you can send it to them with return postage, and maybe they can sign it and ship it back to you.
Oh.
But you got to send return postage. That's the only way it can be done. In regards to the fact that Calvin Parker, my friend Calvin Parker, and I can honestly say that I talked to him a week before he passed on the phone, and he said it was really difficult for him to sit up. He didn't have the energy to barely sit up in the chair. But he passed from stage 5 cancer. He was a really good friend. He will be missed. He was someone you could respect and honestly believe. So rest in peace, Calvin.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with you, Jim. And that cap that Calvin's wearing there, I have here, and it's signed by Calvin. He sent me that last year. And
You
it was
have the original cap?
I have that cap he's wearing in that photograph.
That's awesome.
And it's signed by him. And he was he was a lovely, lovely guy. Calvin couldn't care less whether people believed him or not.
Right.
It would take odds with them if they called him a liar. Though that was different.
Right.
But he felt vindicated when the Blairs stepped forward and when others said, look, we were driving over the bridge, working in the crane, and we saw that damn thing as well. Yeah. So he'd proven his point,
Right.
And the reason he wanted to tell his story, he wanted to leave his legacy, and his legacy was his story for future generations. And I think we've done that. And Irena and I are the torchbearers for Calvin now he's passed. And, don't be surprised that at some point later this year, we're not knocking on your door again, Tim, with something else we've dug up. So,
okay, no problem. You're more than welcome to be on the panel. Irena, you're more than welcome anytime. And Philip, you are more than welcome. We had a great interview today. I want to thank everybody on panel to taking time out of your Saturday. Thank you very much. And Philip, for taking time away from your football. I understand. I want to thank everybody in the chat room for participating and engaging with our guests and everybody who watched online. And we hope to see you next Wednesday. We're going to dig into the paranormal connection with alien abduction experiences. So good night from everybody on the chat room or on the panel, and we'll see you next Wednesday. Good night, guys.
Good night, all. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.